Hello everyone, I am Dr. Nitasha Pandey and today we'll be discussing the sampling theories and the methods of data collection. So before we jump into the details about sampling, let's first try and understand what a sample is. So whenever we do a research, basically what we do is in a research we try and gather some information, some significant information about a particular population. Say for example, if the topic for my research is the effect of culture on the level of creativity at the primary school level across India. If that is the topic for my research. Here, the population for the research is going to be every primary school student across India. Now, we all know that there are a number of schools in India and every school has a huge number of students studying at the primary level. So altogether, the population is going to be very huge. And if we try to conduct a research on each and every primary school student across India, then the research is going to be very time consuming, very expensive, will need a lot of manpower, and to be honest, it would be a little impractical. So what do we do in such cases? We basically derive a few cases or a few individuals. We take out a few individuals from the population and we call that the sample, and then we conduct the research on that sample. We make our inferences, we draw a conclusion, and then finally we generalize that conclusion onto the whole population. This is basically what we do in a research. You can very well understand from this example that sample is a very important element in research. Like for a good research, we need a good sample. And the sample can be drawn in different ways. And to be specific, we broadly have two types of sampling. We have probability sampling and we have non-probability sampling. Probability sampling means, when we use the probability sampling, that means that every individual or every case of the population has the equal probability of getting included in the sample. And this can be done in a number of ways. Like there are basically three types of probability sampling, that we use. The first is simple random sampling. Now, random is the key word over here, because when we go for the simple random sampling, we extremely randomly select a number of individuals or a number of cases from the population to form our sample. Now that can be done in a different of ways. We can use lottery system. Like if we take the same example of the primary school students across India, then here if we are using the lottery system for simple random sampling, then we can make a chit of each and every student who are studying in every school across India. And then we can keep that in a very big box, and then someone can start picking up those chits, and we can keep picking the chits until we reach the desired number of cases for the sample. And then all the chits that we have picked up, all the names which are there in those chits, those individuals would be included in the sample. Then we can also use a random table method, in which there would be a table of random numbers. And then we will be assigning numbers to every student of every school. And after assigning the numbers to every student, we'll take the table and then we can go in any direction. We can go forward, we can go backward, we can go diagonally, and we'll keep picking one number after another until we have reached our desired number for the sample. And all the numbers that we have picked up, those numbers or the students having those numbers would make the sample. And then there is a third way, which is computerized sampling or computerized randomization, where the computer randomly picks up the number for us, and those numbers, whoever is having those number, all those students would be included in the sample. So these are the three ways in which we can go for the simple random sampling. And simple random sampling is considered to be a very good technique because it has that element of randomness, which ensures that every individual in the population had the same probability or the equal or independent probability of getting included in the sample, which makes the sample a good representation of the population. Then the second type that we have is stratified random sampling. Now this is similar to random sampling when we talk about the randomization process, the process where we are picking up individuals for the sample. But before we proceed to that part, here we first divide the population into stratas. Like if we take the same example of the primary school students. Now we can divide them into two stratas based on the gender, like boys and girls, or we can also divide them into different stratas based on age, like above 8 years, below 8 years, depending on the need of the study. So once we have divided the population into stratas, then we randomly pick up individuals from all the stratas to constitute our final sample. This again has two subtypes. First is proportionate stratified random sampling. Now here we divide the population into stratas, then we see what the proportion of that strata is in the sample, in the population, and then we maintain that same proportion of the stratas in the sample as well. Like say for example, if we are talking about the primary school students, as we have discussed in the previous example, then before we start with the sampling, we'll divide the stratas, which would be boys and girls, for example, in this case, and then we'll see what is the proportion of these two stratas in the population. Say for example, the population is of 20 lakhs. That's the total number of students studying at the primary school level across India. After taking a closer look, we get to know that there are 11 lakhs girls and 9 lakhs boys. Then we have to decide the size of the sample. If the size of the sample is 200, then we have to maintain the same proportion. So here the proportion of girl would be, the number of girls in the study would be 110 and the number of boys would be 90. When we'll go for this, then we'll be maintaining the same proportion of the population, and then after that we'll be randomly selecting the individuals for the study. Then second is disproportionate stratified random sampling. Here again we have those stratas, and we know the proportion of those stratas. Like we'll be knowing that there are 11 lakhs girls and 9 lakhs boys. But when we are drawing the sample, we would be maintaining the same proportion. Like when we are having a sample of 200, we'll be going for 100 boys and 100 girls. This is disproportionate stratified random sampling. Now that brings us to the third type of probability sampling, which is area or cluster sampling. Now, again, it's a random sampling, but here we don't pick up random individuals, but we pick up random areas or random clusters. Like, let's go with the same example of the primary school students being the population. Then if we have to go for this kind of sampling, then we'll probably take the map of India and then randomly pick up states or randomly pick up cities. Even better. And then once we have picked up those random cities, then whichever schools are there in those cities, will be taking the students or will be including the students of those schools into the sample. So this is how it works. And these are the three major types of probability sampling, and that brings us to the non-probability sampling. Now, non-probability sampling is the type of sampling where every individual or every case or object of the population does not have the equal probability of getting included in the sample. Now, that may make you feel that the random sampling or the probability sampling is the better option, which is true to much extent, but in not many cases, non-probability sampling may turn out to be the better or the more practical option, and that's the reason we need to have these kind of samplings as well. So here the first type that we'll be discussing is quota sampling. Now, quota sampling is very similar to the stratified random sampling, only the randomization or the random selection is missing or is not there. So in quota sampling, again, we know our population, we know the stratas of the population, and then we maintain those stratas in the sample as well. But while picking the individuals for the sample, we don't go for any kind of elaborate randomization. We simply pick up the cases, or we simply pick up the individual based on our convenience. So we'll have two stratas of boys and girls in the primary school population. Then we'll know the proportion. We'll know that there are 11 lakhs girls and 9 lakhs boys, and we'll also know that the sample will decide that the sample size is going to be 200. But while picking up those 200 individuals, we won't go for any elaborate process. We'll just simply pick up those individuals based on our convenience and availability. So that is quota sampling. The next is incidental sampling, which is considered to be the most cost-effective technique, because here we just have to know the population, we just have to know the size of sample that we are going for, and then the selection of cases or the selection of individual for the sample is done solely on the basis of convenience and availability. Like if I have to study the primary school students, then I would simply go for the school which is there in my city. Or if I know the principal or the teachers of some school and I know that I can very conveniently have access to the students and I can administer tests on them, then I can go for that school. So it's based on convenience. We pick up the sample on the basis of our convenience. That's accidental sampling or incidental sampling. The third type that we have here is purposive sampling. Now, purposive sampling completely depends on the judgment of the researcher. Now, the researcher has to decide which all individual he wants to include in the sample. He has to see, like he knows the population, and then he has to use his judgment to decide which individual is going to be a good representation of the population. And then based on his judgment, he'll keep picking up individual until he reaches his desired size of sample. The fourth type is snowball sampling. Now, snowball sampling is a very interesting type. Here, we start with a few number of cases. We start with a few individuals, and these few individuals direct us towards other individual. Like we'll start with 4 individual, we'll go to them, we'll take references from them, and then they will be directing us towards, like, every individual will give us 4 names, and then we'll go to those 4 people that every individual has directed us towards, and then every individual over there also is going to give us few more names, and this process will keep on going until we have reached the desired size for our sample. It's now this technique is very much clear from the name itself, snowball sampling. We know how the snowball is made. Like one simple snowflake starts rolling from the top of the mountain, and it starts including more and more flakes into it as it rolls down, and after it has crossed half the way, it turns into a big ball of snow. In the same way, we start with fewer number of individual and they start including more and more individual as we go, and finally we end up with the desired sample that we want, desired number of individual in the sample that we want for the study. So this is snowball sampling. And then finally, the fifth type that we have is self-selection sampling. Now here the researcher doesn't have to go anywhere. The sample comes to him. Like once he has decided the research that he will be doing, then he spreads the news that he so and so individual is doing such kind of research and he needs volunteers. And as this news goes to different people of different stratas, or as the news spreads in the target population, then the interested individual comes for the research on their own. They volunteer themselves for the purpose of research, and this is how this kind of sampling is done. So that is all about the different types of sampling. And a sample, as we know, is very important, and drawing of the sampling has to be done very wisely for a research to be a good one. But despite that, we have to understand that some kind of sampling error still might be there, because sampling error is not error in the process of drawing the sample, but sampling error is basically the discrepancy between the population and the sample, or the variability that happens within the sample, which results in the variability in the variability that happens within the population, which leads to the variability in the sampling as well, or in the sample as well. So this is something which is inevitable, because over a period of time, variability can happen in the population. And if different sample has been drawn in the same manner from the same population, still there can be some variation in those samples as well. So the result can also vary a little. That is what happens in sampling error. And we have to understand that this is something which is common, which is inevitable, and which might happen. But the aim for us is to minimize that sampling error. Too much of discrepancy or too much of variation can lead to more sampling error or greater sampling error. We have to keep it to the minimum. That is the aim. And that we can do by using good sampling technique, that we can do by having a decent size of sample, and that we can also do by having a good statistical technique, which can minimize the variability that happens between different samples. So that is how we can minimize it. But we have to understand what it is and how inevitable it is. Now with that, we come to the second part of our today's session, which is the methods for data collection. So we will be very quickly going through some of the methods, some of the techniques, or some of the tools. And we'll start with the interview technique. Now, interview technique is a technique where two individuals sit face to face, where the interviewer asks a couple of questions to the interviewee or to the respondent, and try to get the information that he or she needs for the study. Now, this interview can be of two types. It can be either formal interview or informal interview. Formal interview or structured interview is the kind of interview where there is already a set list of questions, already prepared list of questions, which has to be asked to the respondent in a particular order in which it is mentioned, and the interviewer simply have to keep asking those questions and getting the response on those questions. So it's very structured and it has a definite framework. Whereas the informal interview or the unstructured interview does not have any preset list of questions. The question is decided with the flow of the interview, like the kind of responses that the interviewee or the respondent is giving, that decides which question the interviewer will be asking next, or which questions would be asked later will be decided by the direction of the conversation and the flow of the conversation. So here the interviewer has to be very skilled and has to have a good judgment so that he can decide the direction and flow of the conversation, and he knows which question to ask at what point of time. The second method is observation. Here we do not directly approach the individual and ask for information, but we observe the individual or the group in action and we gather the information that we want. Again, this can be of this method can be of two types. Based on the involvement of the researcher, it can be either participant or it can be non-participant. If it's participant observation, then the individual or the researcher will become a part of the group, will join the group, will become a member of the group, and he will, being a part of the group, becomes an important element, and from inside he tries to observe everyone's behavior and try to gather all the information that he needs. Whereas in non-participant observation, he does not become a part of the group. He stays just an observer, a distant observer who tries and observes the group from a distance, and from there he gathers all the information that he needs. The third technique is the survey technique, or the third method is the survey method. Now, in this method, we do not go for a very elaborate or very extensive kind of process for gathering information, but we have such tools over here in survey method, which tools help us to gather more and more information in shorter duration and with lesser effort. And that's the reason why it's said that the survey method can be used on the whole population. As we discussed, it can be used on the whole population, and it can be used by using different techniques. So we have some techniques within survey method that we can make use of. The first is personal interview. Now, this personal interview is different from the interview method that we had talked about. That interview method needed a lot of observation of the verbal and non-verbal cues and explanation of the questions and all. Here, there are very short, direct questions that the researcher has to ask, and he has to look for very direct answers to those questions. So it's not that time consuming, and the researcher can administer that same list of questions on a number of individuals in a shorter period of time. So this is how it's constructed. It's constructed in a manner so that more information from more individuals can be gathered in lesser time. The second type is mail questionnaire. This is considered to be very cost effective, because here the researcher simply makes a list of prepares a questionnaire and then makes a number of copies, and then he mails it to the whole population, probably along with a self-addressed envelope, for them to answer the questionnaires and mail it back to him, the researcher. So this is how the mail questionnaire works. And then the third technique, which is again used, is the telephone survey, where the researcher makes calls to every individual from the population and asks them some direct questions and tries to gather the needed information from them. So these are the three types or techniques within survey method that we widely use. The next technique is sociometry. Now, this is a very interesting technique which is somewhat similar to the snowball sampling that we have earlier discussed. Here, it's a quantitative method for measuring social relationship and social dynamics. It's used more in social setups like school and offices. And in this, we go to different individuals and we ask them questions like, who do you want to sit beside while working? Or if you are in need, which person will you go to for help? And then whichever name comes up, then we go to those individuals and ask them the same question. They might give the name of the individual who first took their name, or they might give you some new names. Then we go to those individuals and we keep on doing this until we are able to understand the internal structure or the internal dynamic within that group. So this is how this technique or this method works. Next, we have life history analysis. This is again qualitative research in which we try to understand the whole picture of an individual's life. We gather information through interview and other techniques about the individual's whole life. We try and understand what his attitude is, what his thoughts and behaviors are today, and how it was in the past, and how it has impacted his life decisions, and how it has made him do the things that he has done in his life, and how overall his life has progressed. So it gives us a very clear life picture of an individual and helps us understand that individual in a very detailed manner. And finally, we have the process of meta-analysis, which is a statistical analysis that combines the result of multiple scientific studies. Now, when there are a number of studies done on a given topic, and every study is slightly maybe giving slightly different results, or every study is having some limitation, then in meta-analysis what we do is we take all the studies together, and then we do a complete detailed analysis of all those studies so that we can come to a final conclusion with more accuracy. And once we do that, then we are able to make a better generalization on a larger population, because this finding is based on a number of studies done on different samples. So altogether, the whole sample size for the study becomes very huge, and we get too much information, and proper synthesis and proper analysis of all that information gives us a very accurate and very precise information on the basis of which we can draw a good conclusion, which we can safely generalize on the population. So these are the techniques or the methods that we'll be discussing for today. Although there are many other methods there for data collection, but these were the ones that we were supposed to discuss. And with this, we come to the end of the talk, and now we are open for discussion. So if you have any question, you can ask those questions to me now. Just now I have got a question that you need some elaboration on the sampling techniques. So if you go through this video again, you'll see that I've already discussed the probability sampling and the non-probability sampling. And within the probability sampling, I have discussed the simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and areas or cluster sampling with example. And then I've also discussed non-probability sampling. I don't mind discussing it again, but right now we do not have that much time. But still, I'll try to explain the difference between the different types of sampling in the time that we have. So as I told you, that sample is the number of cases that we extract from the population for the purpose of our study. So it has two types: the probability sampling and the non-probability sampling. Probability sampling means that every individual of the population had the equal probability, or has the equal probability of getting included in the sample. And the non-probability sampling means that each and every individual from the population did not have the equal probability of getting included in the sample. So from the definition, it might get clear to you that the probability sampling is any day a better form of sampling, because it will ensure good representation of the population. But in many cases, because of some practical issues, we have to go for the non-probability sampling, and we can use any of the sampling or any of the type of the sampling, keeping in mind that we are doing it in a genuine manner, sincerely, and we are maintaining a good sample size. Once we do that, then whichever technique we use, that will give us a good sample to work on for the purpose of research. Now, I have another question, which is regarding the field in which we use sociometry method. Now, sociometry method, as we discussed, is about the interpersonal relationship. So it's clear from that only that it is mostly used in social sciences. Wherever we are studying human behavior, human interaction, human dynamics, those are the areas in which we will be using sociometry.